So you have a military strike, a devastating death toll, and the official justification? Self-defense. An event like this forces us all to grapple with some of the toughest questions there are about the rules of war. So let's break down the international laws that decide not just if a country can go to war, but how it has to fight.
This is the image that kicked off a firestorm of debate around the world. A school just flattened and more than 150 people killed. The question that hangs over the scene isn't just a moral one, it's a legal one. Under the laws of war, was this allowed?
Okay, so before we can get into the legal weeds, we need to be really clear on what actually happened. Let's start with just the basic, undisputed facts that set this whole thing in motion.
So here's the breakdown. You have a coordinated strike by the US and Israel. Their target was a girls' school in Iran. The result was a massive loss of life. Now, the official story was that this building wasn't just a school anymore, it was being actively used by militants. And that claim right there immediately puts this entire incident right under the microscope of international humanitarian law.
As you'd expect, an action like this doesn't happen without an official justification. So what was the specific legal argument they used to defend it? Let's take a closer look. The two phrases to lock onto here are preemptive and imminent threat. See, this wasn't sold as payback for an attack that already happened. No, this was framed as a strike to stop an attack that was about to happen. And legally speaking, that is a very, very high bar to clear. And that really gets us to the core of the legal puzzle here. It's one thing to say a threat is imminent, but international law has a surprisingly strict and narrow definition of what that word actually means.
To really get that definition, we've got to look at the first of two big buckets of international law. This first set of rules is all about the decision to use force in the first place.
You know, after the absolute devastation of World War II, the world came together and basically said, never again. They created the United Nations, and the #1 goal of its founding document, the UN Charter, was to stop wars before they even start. The default setting is simple. You cannot use force against another country, period.
But of course, there's a huge exception, and that's self-defense. If you suffer an armed attack, the Charter says you have the right to fight back. But notice that specific wording, armed attack. The Charter doesn't explicitly say you have the right to strike first. This whole idea of preemptive self-defense is a much more modern and, frankly, a hugely controversial interpretation of that rule.
So when you put the two side by side, it's pretty stark. For a preemptive strike to even be on the table legally, the threat has to be overwhelming, leaving you with absolutely no other choice and no time to even think it over. The question becomes, does the official reason for this strike get anywhere close to meeting that incredibly high legal standard?
Okay, let's play devil's advocate for a minute. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that the decision to launch the strike was legal. Well, the legal analysis doesn't stop there, not even close. There's a whole separate body of law that dictates how you have to conduct yourself during a conflict.
This is where international humanitarian law, or IHL, comes in. You can think of it like this. Its job isn't to prevent wars, it's to try and limit the horror once they've started. It's basically a rulebook designed to protect people who aren't fighting anymore or were never fighting in the first place.
And IHL really boils down to three core ideas. First, distinction. You have to be able to tell the difference between fighters and civilians and only target the fighters. Second, proportionality. Any harm you might cause to civilians can't be excessive compared to the military goal you're trying to achieve. And third, precaution. You have to do everything you possibly can to avoid hurting civilians. So let's apply that first principle, distinction. The rule is crystal clear. Civilian places, like schools, are protected. You can't target them. But the counterargument here was that the school had lost that protection, that the moment militants started using it for military purposes, it became a legitimate military target. So, can a protected place like a school actually lose its status? Well, legally, the answer is yes, it can. If it's being used to contribute to military action, its protection can be forfeit. But, and this is a really big but, the burden of proof is incredibly high on the force that launches the attack to show that was actually happening.
But let's keep going. Even if you can prove the school was a legitimate target, you still have to clear that second hurdle, proportionality. This requires a commander on the ground to do a kind of grim calculation, a balancing act, before they give the order to fire. Imagine a scale. On one side, you put the expected military advantage from the strike. On the other, you have to put the foreseeable civilian harm. In this case, we know that was over 150 dead and a destroyed school. The law is very, very clear. If the civilian harm side of the scale is excessive compared to the military gain, the attack is illegal.
So we've walked through all these detailed laws, these complex ideas of distinction and proportionality, but all of this leads to a pretty fundamental question. What actually happens when these rules get broken? Who holds anyone accountable?
And here's the reality of the situation. Unlike the laws in your own country, there is no world police force. There's no one to call. Enforcement, at the end of the day, is largely political and depends on the will of other countries to act.
So you might be asking, well, if you can't always enforce it, what's the point? And that's fair. The point is to set a standard. It creates the very framework that lets us judge an action like this. It gives the world a vocabulary for condemnation, and it makes sure that when a country steps way out of line, it gets put under a global microscope.
This quote from Karthikeya Singh from the original article really sums it up perfectly. The system isn't perfect, not by a long shot, but its real power is that it ensures these events are seen, debated, and judged against the set of rules that we've all, as a global community, agreed to.
So in the end, international law doesn't always provide easy, black and white answers. What it does provide is a universal yardstick. It gives us the crucial questions we have to ask to make sense of the conduct of nations in the middle of a conflict.
And that leaves us with one final, huge question to think about. We've established this shared standard, this rulebook for war. But it's one thing to have rules on paper. It's something else entirely to actually uphold them. So if these laws really belong to all of us, who has the power? And maybe more importantly, who has the responsibility to make